So to pick up the thread, this is Castle. At the time when the preservation company was just beginning to prepare for running services. So you can see some of the track work has had a deturfing, but not a lot else. Up by the signal box, look, there's a trolley runoff point, a series of sleepers, and sitting on the loop is the Austin trolley, which is a vehicle that some of you may not have encountered, and we will come back to in some detail in a little while. Still having to juggle with this, so excuse me. So this is Castle now, at the time when the signal box has been turned into a booking office and a platform has been built. Although I have to say that I do wonder what anyone ever thought that platform was going to be used for, because it's barely one coach long, a little bit strange. This is looking up to London Bank, and you can see well into the era when we were thinking about running passenger trains. It was heavily overgrown. The ditches in the cutting were simply not going to carry any water away. And this is a view of the Kink. Now, the first thing to notice is that all those trees up on the hillside have gone, which is part of the story. I was told, although it was before my time, that what happened was that during the closure period, that area on the left was logged out, and they took all the timbers across to the other side of the river by anchoring a steel ropeway to the rails. The result was that the railway was dragged by the weight of all this sideways significantly towards the right in this view, and the result, it also went down the bank. And you can see that in addition to attempting to level up the railway, there's been a significant amount of stone put where that slip took place to try to keep the rails in place. But even then, when you look down the line, you'll see that the alignment is still very iffy. Certainly when I started on the railway, 62, 63, although the alignment was okay, there was great difficulty in stopping the railway from sliding sideways towards the river. So in my day, the Kink wasn't horizontal, but it was vertical. The riverside rail was below the other rail by about 3 inches at the worst point. You went through there very carefully. And certainly on a locomotive, you could feel the locomotive lurch towards the river and then straighten up again. And then west of that, going down towards the Banbury Bridge, is Colonel Robbo's Bridge. We'll come back to why it's called Colonel Robbo's in a bit, and a very prominent 5 mile an hour speed restriction sign. This is a view looking eastwards at Schoolmistress's bungalow, very much the railway as it was when I first knew it. Very heavily overgrown. And my first job ever on the railway was to help with this task, which was to deturf the joints, nothing else, deturf the joints and get some sleepers underneath that would hold the railway reasonably robustly. The section from here westwards towards Dolreed Mill, there was an occupation crossing known as Egg and Bacon Crossing, because the hens were always all over the railway. The insects, particularly ants, were very aggressively attacking the sleepers. So it was essentially, if we did nothing else, to redo under the joints. Now we come to an interesting little era in the early W&L history, the question of signals. So here is Llanfair, and here is a lever frame. And as you can see, a signal. We'll come to the signal in a minute. The lever frame is not the one that is there now. The one that's there now came from Llanfair Mire. This is the lever frame from Buttington Crossing. It's a Dutton frame, but if you look at the extreme far end of it, you will see that there was a housing for where the gate wheel was attached. We acquired 3 lever frames that went to Llanfair. That's one of them. Another one came from the Mid Wales line that Colin Betts bought and gave to the railway. None of these were ever connected up. And there was a great debate in the early days of the railway as to what signals we needed at all. That just shows the fun and games that we had in the old days. No cranes, of course, and putting up anything like a half-decent signal. And the signal that's there now, the bracket signal by the signal box, was also erected by rope and pulley. But what was bizarre in this period was that the people who were enthusiasts about signals went ahead and started signalling the railway without any real plan to it. So here is Castle, and you'll see now the platform's been extended. But there's a little ground shunt signal there, painted up, installed ready. And just off view, you can't see it because it's in this photograph, there was a signal post for a full-sized arm. And there's another view of the ground signal. And if you look up the cutting, way, way beyond the signal box, you can see a little white blob, which is another signal we'll come back to in a minute. And as you see, the signal enthusiasts had started putting in pulleys on the ground with no obvious concept of what they were going to be connected to and how they were going to work. Oops, come back. This signal would have been useful. This is coming up the top of the Larthen, and many of the drivers who would have liked to have known whether the level crossing was open or not, and that was what this signal was intended to do. We are at the White Bridge. We were very lucky when the Welsh Pool was inspected prior to opening to passengers with the inspecting officer who came to look at the railway, Colonel Robertson. He could quite easily have said that we had to relay miles of track before he would allow us to open. But he knew that that was beyond the company's capacity. And all he did was to require a few minor details to be dealt with. One was that bridge just west of the Banbury Bridge, which he insisted should have a 5 mile-an-hour speed restriction on. And his other requirement was that this bridge, which is actually quite a drop if you fell off it, be fitted with handrails. So the White Bridge got its handrails. They were made up from board and tube welded together, and we painted it white. And Ronald was satisfied. It would have been nice to have that signal. Many drivers would have appreciated it, but it was wildly impractical because having picked a colour light, they picked a searchlight signal. Now that requires 2 different voltages, one for the lamp and one for the operating mechanism. And there is no obvious way in which electricity was going to be supplied, nor was there any obvious way in which it was going to be controlled. And even worse, the signal is sloping upwards if you look. Now, a searchlight signal produces a very concentrated beam. If that signal had been operational, it would have been illuminating the sky, but the drivers wouldn't have been able to see it. In any event, it never got commissioned. But the weirdest of all was this. This is up the cutting, leaving Castle, going towards Silvan, and on a wooden post, somebody has put a semaphore arm. That is all. There is no operating mechanism. There is no ladder. And eventually, the W&LLR decided very clearly that we didn't need staff instruments. We could work with staff and ticket. And apart from Llanfair and eventually Welsh Pool, we didn't need signals either. But we did get the signals at Llanfair. The lever frame we saw earlier on isn't there because it spent some of its time on the other side of the line where that hut is. A more bizarre place to put a lever frame, frankly, it's hard to imagine because, of course, anyone in there working the frame wouldn't be able to see anything going on if somebody parked wagons on the headshow. Another slightly bizarre idea.
Just a thought there, Mike. I have a suspicion we still have Buttington frame. The Llanfair frame only had 11 levers, but what's in the box today has 17 lever positions. And I think if there were both Dutton direct tappet frames, which were modular, Buttington was used to extend Llanfair.
It might have been, but the other frame that came up was Dol Dowlod from the Mid Wales line, the Colin Betts board.
Okay.
So where the spare levers came, and indeed what happened to the other levers, I do not know.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Right, moving on to locomotives. One thing the W&LLR was incredibly lucky on is that the locomotives were preserved. And to that, I think we can acknowledge real thanks to Oliver Velton, who was the district operating superintendent for the Cambrian section, based at Oswald Street. And he made sure that if nothing else got saved, the locomotives did. So they got taken off to Oswald Street and put at the back of the shed, waiting for something to happen. And they got ready. You notice that they put a third rail in the pit so that you could move the locomotive backwards and forwards if you needed to. Now, the Earl didn't need a lot of work. So it was back on the railway quite early. It came back to the railway in 1961, well before the Countess. So from that point onwards, we had a powerful steam locomotive. The Planet didn't come till 1962. So there was a time when this was effectively the only locomotive of any power. We got the Raven, of course. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because there are quite a few photographs inside Oswald Street Works. There's 823, which is going to have a lot of work done on it, and that's, I think, is its ashpan. Because a lot of work included restaying almost the whole of the firebox. It was a big, big job that they did for us at Oswald Street. Those I take to be brand new stays, and you can see a whole load have been drilled out. And if you go around to the other side, you can see that they put the new stays in. And fortunately, someone has penciled on that a date. So it's the 18th of February, 62, or thereabouts. This locomotive was going through the works. Pardon me. It came to us later in the year. We're not going to dwell too long on this. This looks to me like the hydraulic test because there's some sort of barometer attached to the loco up by the dome. And I think all the stays and everything else are in place, and there's a gauge glass there as well. We owe a lot to the people who did all this for us, and then they covered it as they did in those days with white asbestos. A whole heap of it on the floor. Now we know what we know about asbestos. That scene makes you shudder, doesn't it? But there we are. And the frames were lifted to allow work to be done on the motional wheels as required. And then they started putting it back together. It's a source of some disappointment to me that none of these images in Yeoman's collection are dated. I don't even know if I got them in the right order. But lovely to know the dates on which he went, and we could then follow the progress of the restoration of this loco. Because, let me go back one. There she is facing with her bunker towards the back wall. And the next photograph, she's on bricks and she's facing the other way. So I won't dwell too long on these. They then started doing what was going to be the superb paint job that we know she's enjoyed as soon as she came back to us. So she's now nearly getting ready to come. Significant work being done. The new paint livery being applied. Beautiful job. Beautiful job. And then come the day. And the day here is the 5th of October, 1962. This is loco 46512 on the Class 8, which was the 9:30 Monday, Wednesday and Friday only pickup from Oswald Street. And if you look down towards the back of the train, down by the breakdown, you will see our lovely loco arriving. Arriving on the platform. And then the loco behind, the standard tank, would shunt the loco round towards the Smithfield. Gleaming in the afternoon sun, she is shunted round and then left by the cattle drop. Well, they didn't want it to move in transit, did they? And there it is, photograph of the loco in the setting sun, waiting for the next day. And the next day was the Shrewsbury crane. The Shrewsbury crane arrived to lift her off over onto that siding, which I mentioned to you we still had down there. And it was a careful lift. Everybody standing a respectful distance, apart from a couple of our members, as they lifted the loco over. And loaded down onto the rails. Now, I'm not quite sure about the next part of the story, but I think I've got it right. By this stage, we had the coaches, we had the Planet Diesel, and I think that they ran a special down to Washpool to commemorate the occasion. I may have got it wrong, this may be a different train. But she came back up, hauled by the Earl, with a flag on the front. Mick Courier's the driver there, a regular driver on the WLLR in those days. And that is the same train coming up to level crossing Buckley. Meantime, the Countess was quietly and gently steamed, didn't attempt to tow her up. And later on, as the evening light was falling, she was quietly worked up to London. Beautiful loco. Now then, we're skipping back in time a bit. We've seen that on the signalling side, people tended to not exactly do their own thing, but the different groups, and the early W&L was very much group-based, they had their own projects. And this was a project. This was going to be a trolley. And this is indeed, in its garage where it was built, this is the Austin trolley. And it was built around an Austin car engine. And it came out, whoops, let's go back one. It came out with the works looking like that. Still very much in trial mode, obviously, because there's no seat for the driver. A slightly peculiar beast because it had a car and a car gearbox. And that left me with a question, well, how do we do reverse? So it actually had two gearboxes in the drive. And it was possible actually to put it into double reverse, in which case it would sort of crawl along very, very slowly. And that's a side view. I'll leave that on the screen for a minute so I can discuss it. So the people, bless them, built this, but I have no idea, and I've never found anybody who could tell me what they thought it could be used for. First thing you'll notice is that at this stage, and I don't know whether they were ever fitted, there's no brakes. It doesn't have any obvious carrying capacity. It doesn't have any obvious way in which it can be coupled to anything. So, and there's no seats, so it's not at all clear what anyone ever thought it could be used for. But worst of all, you notice it has no springs. And that was ultimately its downfall. On the W&L track at the time, a vehicle with no springs was going to derail frequently, and it did. Very clear that the thing's quite a long wheelbase, very, very rigid. So that's it, up the line by the quarry. And that's the only photograph I've got of it fully complete when it had its bonnet cover on and the seat. But the truth is, when I first knew the railway in '62, this was already out of use. All the effort, I'm afraid, went unloved because it simply wouldn't stay on the rails. Unlike this is the much-loved Wickham trolley. In the early days, the era that I'm talking about, early 60s, very few members had cars. Car ownership was still a dream in the future for many families. And the Wickham did a lot of miles just carrying people about. The favourite was that volunteers who were going home at midweek and wanted to catch a late train to from Washpool, would take the Wickham down to Washpool, Raven Square usually and leave it there, go and catch their train, and then the trolley would be worked back some convenient time in the following week. So it did a lot of miles, and it was quite exciting to ride on, even more exciting to ride on in the dark, and I've done that. Don't know the occasion for this photograph, but I'll do what I can for identification of the people. The chap with his suit, I think, is Mr. J.D. Howe, who was the company's civil engineer at the time. Now, one of those two, and I think it's the chap on the left, is a man called Chris Thacker. He played a very important part in the earliest days of the W&L when we didn't have access to Lambeth, because the coal merchants still had the yards and the railway was based at Welshpool. He was the projectionist at the cinema in Welshpool, which meant that most days, unless he got a matinee on, his days were free. And he looked after all that stuff that was at Raven Square. I think he carried the title of company stores officer, but basically he was the key holder. If you wanted to do anything down at Raven Square, he would be the man who would be able to let you in and sort out everything you needed. So he is one of the unsung heroes, Chris Thacker, who rather faded from the scene when we moved our basis of operations up to Lambeth. This locomotive will be familiar to, I guess, to many of you. It's still around. It's another one of these projects which the early W&L took on because it seemed like a good idea. And with the advantage of hindsight, one may be a little bit doubtful about it. So this is Nutty, which was regauged to come and work for us. Useful little shunter. But it didn't get much use. I was chatting once with one of the drivers, and he wasn't alone in this feeling. The point about Nutty is that to drive it, you stand between the frames. So the frames come almost up to your knees. You climb them out that tiny little step. But one thing you couldn't do is get out quickly. Now, inside that cab, the gauge glass is at your chest height. So if you were misfortunate enough to have a broken gauge glass, it will be right at chest height and in your face, and you will be very slow in getting off the loco. And I knew of a couple of drivers who simply wouldn't work it. They just felt that that loco was unsafe. Eventually, of course, it went away. And this is a reminder of what it was like working on locos in the early days of the W&L. We had an open pit down the end down where the signal boxes were. But any other work you wanted to do, you did in the open. All the cabbage and wagon painting and everything else was done in the open. If you wanted to work on the loco and get a little bit of cover, that was what you did. And the fact that we had working locos is a tribute to everybody who worked on them at the time. This is the Earl then, being painted under those sort of conditions, but also required in traffic because we were quite short of locomotives. And behind it is that cattle van, which eventually wound up on the Festin Yard. So a view of Castle, there's the cattle van again. Signal box, the Earl on the train, and by the trolley turn-off point, under the sheet, is the poor old Austin trolley. And that was how I knew her first. She was one of the things that eventually just sort of quietly faded from the scene. We needed coaches, of course, and we were lucky in the end to get stuff from the Chatterton and Upnor. But remember, when these coaches were delivered, the only locomotive we had was Raven. So it was quite an achievement to even get them to where they are in this photograph. To get them out of Welshpool, they were worked forward to here at Dover. Working them at all, given that they had different coupling heights and everything else, was quite a game in itself. Whoops. And here's the other big coach that we got from the Chatterton and Upnor, not with us anymore. Now, I personally liked this coach because, like the little brake vans, which have a lot of concrete in them to give them adhesion, this thing has a lot of concrete in them. You can see the depth of the frames, and the frames were full of concrete. So if you screw the brakes down on this coach, it stopped, and it would stop anything. But in terms of usefulness on a passenger railway, it was a bit different. First of all, it's a very high step up to get in. And then there were two compartments, the guards compartment at the end with the lookout, and then two passenger compartments, a small one next to the guards compartment, first class for officers, and the other one nearer this end was for other ranks. But the real problem from the W&L's operation point of view was that for all that weight, it carried very few passengers. It wasn't really terribly good value for money in operational terms. So you see it on a lot of the early passenger trains, because in the days before vac and brake, you were working a passenger train in the wet, you wanted a brake that was going to stop the train. And for all its faults, that would certainly do the job. So here's a nice photograph of the interim period. So there's wee little Raven, look, on the running line. Coaches have worked their way down to Caereinion, which is what we see here in this picture. And rather bizarrely, in the far distance, there's a sloping ramp. I have a feeling that someone moved that sheep loading ramp, which we had seen earlier on the roadside, a different side. Dodging back in time again, this is then Raven, down on the siding that we had at Raven Square, which we'd obviously put in because you can see there's some short sleepers. Now, the siding was a good idea for transfer from BR wagons to ours, but it really wasn't in the right place. It's far too far from the BR line. And in the days when we were ballasting our railway with spent BR ballast coming in, we had to stand in the wagon there and throw the ballast over onto one of these flats over that enormous gap. And having done some of that, I can tell you, it was quite tiring and quite an achievement. But on this occasion, the transfer was something different. They are transferring sleepers. So there's the Raven on one wagon, loading sleepers. The Raven was an underground loco. When we got it, it was fitted with a tall exhaust to take the exhaust fumes away from the driver's face, which was a good idea. And there is, going up to the top of the chimney, what looks like a bracing strut. But for those who don't know it, it wasn't that at all. Raven had no means of whistling or whatever. So what happened was it was fitted with a valve in the top of the chimney, operated by that rod. And if you pulled the rod, it diverted the exhaust into a whistle. So as it chugged along, it would whistle in short little bursts, according to the exhaust. So here's a load of recovered sleepers going up. We had quite a lot of sleepers from BR in the early days, a particularly big batch from Cressidge on the Severn Valley, and that was lifted. And quite a few of them came in and transferred this way. A couple of other things to mention. The chap scratching his head is the driver. That's Basil Roberts, who was extremely helpful in the early years of the W&L. He was a locomotive fitter from Old Oak, so well versed in fitting locomotives, including diesels. And the other thing you notice on the front is the sand bucket, because on a slightly damp day, she wasn't going to get up the hill without some sand. And that's her coming up the hill. Basil Roberts driving. I don't know the identity, I'm afraid, of any of the others. And just about to top the gradient coming up to the canal bridge. And here's the loco again on another day. No idea what they're out to do. Henniarth, of course, is the location. And this is her coming down again. This is trundling from Henniarth down towards Schoolmistress's cottage, and a very useful view, reminding us of what the track was like in 1960, 1961.